Hello and welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. My name is Dr. Roger K. Green. This is a course on Homer and the critique of Western civilization, and this is a contextualized reading lecture for Book 11, The Kingdom of the Dead. And this is, of course, one of the most sort of famous, I think, moments in Homer's Odyssey. The narrative continues directly from the previous book, and so Odysseus says that they're heading off with all of the instructions of Circe to the kingdom of the dead. So now we came down. Now down we came to the ship at the water's edge. We hauled and launched her into the sunlit breakers first, stepped the mast in the black craft, and set our sail and loaded the sheep aboard the ram and the ewe. Then we ourselves embarked, streaming tears, our hearts weighed down with anguish. And anguish, of course, because they have yet another task to accomplish before going home to Ithaca. We look at where they're traveling, and Odysseus says the ship made the outer limits, the ocean's rivers bounds, where Cimmerian people have their homes, their realm and city shrouded in the mist and cloud. The eye of the sun can never flash his rays through the dark and bring them light. And I've been interested in these peoples, in these lectures that show up in passing. So like the Kikones, right, who I've talked about in earlier contextualized readings, the city that Odysseus just sacks without, giving any possible explanation really for it. When we look it up, of course, it looks like the Kikones sided with the Trojans during the Trojan War, and therefore were available for sacking after the end of the Trojan War. I'm not sure that makes it any better. But the Cimmerian people, when you look them up, they are people from the Pontic steppes. So this would put Odysseus and his men up to the north end of the Black Sea in terms of real world geography. And sometimes these people are associated with, or perhaps the predecessors of, another people called the Scythians, who are definitely the barbarians of other Greek texts that show up in Herodotus, for example. People whose ways are completely foreign to the Greeks. People who seem, quote, savage and barbaric. And so this, of course, is going to be the land associated up north with the land of the dead. They get to where they need to be, and then they follow all of the ritual suggestions that Circe had provided. So here at the spot, Paramades and Eurylochus held the victims fast, and I, drawing my sharp sword from beside my hip, dug a trench of about a forearm's length, and around it poured libations out to all the dead, first with milk and honey, and then with mellow wine over it all, and time and again I vowed to all the dead, to the drifting, listless spirits of their ghosts, that once I returned to Ithaca, I would slaughter a barren heifer in my halls, the best I had, and load a pyre with treasures, and to Tiresias alone, apart, I would offer a sleek black ram, the pride of all my herds. And once my vows and prayers had invoked the nations of the dead, I took the victims over to the trench, I cut their throats, and the dark blood flowed in, and up out of Erebus they came, flocking toward me now, the ghosts and the dead of the dead and gone. And so Erebus here is this primordial blackness, this primordial darkness that from out of the depths that the dead come to Odysseus. And so this language is repeated again, the ritualized language. So it seems to be textually important to Homer, the author of this epic. We see this ritual. I've mentioned that there are closer relationships, and we see some closer ones with this the suo we torilia sacrifice. Although there is not a pig in this one, but there's a pig in one that shows up later. Remember, Odysseus's men were being associated with pigs as well in the previous chapter, and we know that Odysseus's men are not going to make it home as well. So there is a way that Odysseus's men are being, quote, sacrificed throughout the text here. I ordered the men at once to flay the sheep that lay before us, killed by my ruthless blade, and burn them both, and then say prayers to the gods, to the almighty god of death, the dread Persephone. And it's interesting, I mean, Persephone is the death god here. We don't get Hades, right? We only get Persephone here. As well, although we know that in other Greek myths, Persephone is in the underworld because she has been wedded to Hades, and that her mother Demeter, who's the grain goddess, is weeping for the part of the year that Persephone is in the underworld, and that's what creates winter. And so we get that cycle of stories in different contexts, but that doesn't seem to be the focus for Homer the poet in this, at least this part of his tale. And then the first person that comes up is Elpenor. And so we see this kind of woven texture into the composition of the Odyssey here. Like, it was kind of weird maybe a few books ago to see Elpenor die this sudden death. Left behind, he got drunk and crawled out onto Circe's roof. And now here they meet him in the underworld. And Elpenor asks them to give him a funeral when they get back. And so there is this attention being put on memory, that is very important to the Greeks here. So he says, well, I know when you leave this lodging of the dead that you and your ship will put ashore again at the island of Aea. Then and there, my lord, remember me. I beg you, don't sail off and desert me, left behind unwept, unburied. Don't, or my curse may draw God's fury on your head. No, burn me in full armor, all my harness, heap my mound by the churning gray surf, a man whose luck run out. So even men to come will learn my story. Perform my rites and plant on my tomb that oar I swung with mates when I rode among the living. And so Odysseus promises to do this. And then we get these other familiar faces that Odysseus sees showing up. And the first is his mother, Anticlea, daughter of the great heart Autolycus, whom I left alive when I sailed for sacred Troy. I broke into tears to see her, but filled with pity, even throbbing with grief, I would not let her ghost approach the blood till I had questioned Tiresias myself. And so it's interesting that Elpenor sort of shows up right away because of this requirement to see Tiresias first, because Tiresias is kind of coming second. At last he came, the shade of the famous Theban prophet, holding a golden scepter, knew me at once and hailed me, royal son of Laertes, Odysseus, master of exploits, man of pain. What now brings you here, forsaking the light of day, to see this joyless kingdom of the dead? Stand back from the trench, put up your sharp sword, so I can drink the blood and tell you all the truth. And so Odysseus does so. He steps back, he sheaths the sword, and we see that Tiresias drinks the blood of the sacrificed animals that Odysseus has just cut the throats of. He says, Odysseus says, a sweet smooth journey home, renowned Odysseus, Tiresias says, a sweet smooth journey home, renowned Odysseus, that is what you seek, but a god will make it hard for you. I know you will never escape the one who shakes the earth, Poseidon, right? Quaking with anger at you, still enraged because you blinded the Cyclops, his dear son. Even so, you and your crew may still reach home, suffering all the way, if you only have the power to curb that wild desire, and curb your own. What's more, from the day your good trim vessel first puts into at Thrinacia island, flees the cruel blue sea, there you will find them grazing herds of fat flocks, the cattle of Helios, god of the sun, who sees all, hears all things. Leave the beasts unharmed, your mind set on home. And we know from the beginning of the Odyssey, right, that this is exactly the thing that Odysseus's men ignore. So we will get that story eventually. They kill the cattle of the sun, and that is why Odysseus's men cannot return home. I'm connecting a little bit in this contextualized reading the idea that they have been turned into pigs in an earlier book, and that they are in a way part of this larger sacrifice that happens as Odysseus journeys on his way, and he's being asked by Tiresias. He's saying that what you are doing is you're becoming tempered, right? You must temper your desires. So there is this balance that is supposed to happen. And then we get this foreshadowing of what will happen in the later books, of course, that Odysseus is going to get home, and that there are these suitors, and he's going to pay them back in blood. But Tiresias says, once you've killed those suitors in your halls by a stealth or in open flight with a slashing bronze, go forth once more. You must carry your well-planned oar until you come to a race of people who know nothing of the sea, whose food is never seasoned with salt, strangers all to ships with the crimson prows and long slim oars, wings that make ships fly. And here is your sign, unmistakable, clear, so clear you cannot miss it, when another traveler falls in with you and calls the weight across your shoulder, a fan to winnow grain, and plant your bladed balanced oar in the earth, and sacrifice fine beasts to the lord of the sea, Poseidon, a ram, a bull, and a ramping wild boar. Then journeying home, and render noble offerings up to the deathless gods who rule the vaulting skies, to all the gods in order. And so that is interesting. So that is where the boar shows up again. So if we're looking at this as a predecessor kind of ritual ceremony or sacrifice, that later in Roman terms becomes the sue torilia. So a sheep, a pig, a bull of some sort, a ram, which is a grain sacrifice. It's a sacrifice to the land and agriculture. We see that there's this moving in from the sea that Tiresias is telling Odysseus that he must do. And I want to spend just a little bit of time emphasizing this right now, and emphasizing this notion of sacrifice, because I think in broader culture, when we think about what happens in the Odyssey, it's just about, Odysseus's travels and then he gets back home. But we don't generally focus on the fact that the first 4 books are all about Telemachus, right? They're not even about Odysseus. Doesn't even show up until book 4. And then we're in the midst of the heart of the Odyssey in this middle section, where Odysseus has become the bard, has become the storyteller, and is telling all of his exploits. And we can ask things like that all good literary scholars should ask is Odysseus a reliable narrator, for example? He seems to talk himself up at different moments. We know he's capable of flat out lying to people. So it's something that I think that we should be questioning him as a storyteller. He's definitely enrapturing, as we will see later on in this section. He's enrapturing the Phaeacians with this story. So what we want to just emphasize and keep in your mind right now is that it isn't just that Odysseus goes home and wreaks revenge on the suitors, and there's this bloodbath, and that's the end of the story. There are still things that he must do, according to Tiresias anyway. So then Tiresias leaves, and then or before Tiresias leaves, rather, Odysseus asks about his mother, and how can I talk to these other people? He says, and Tiresias says, one rule there is, the famous seer explained, and simple for me to say and you to learn. Any one of the ghosts you let approach the blood will speak the truth to you. Any one you refuse will turn away. Okay, so there's this binding that the blood does, that the sacrifice does, and I will have different lectures. I have some different lectures, I think, online right now just on the nature of sacrifice itself. It's not the biggest part of this particular course, which is dealing with Homer and the critique of Western civilization, but it is interesting how this communication across that divide between the living and the dead, and between the immortals, the gods, and the humans, is dealing with this notion of sacrifice and transfer as well. And so we can think about this in terms of some of our meditations on race, on the embeddedness of race in the classical world, which is of course not the biological skin color race of the modern world, but if we're taking some of the more recent theories about race that come from something like critical race theory that says that racism is embedded in human culture, for example, over time, we look at the ways that it transforms that hierarchy of power that humans have in their relationships with one another that makes them other one another. We could look at the gods in that sense as a particular race, just as the other peoples are being figured as races, like something more like nation in the ancient world. And so we might think, one way I've been thinking to think about this more recently in the broader context of this class is to think about the ways that the ideas of race, the more recent ideas, which we know are historically derived, which are the notion, the pseudoscientific notion of biological race, for example, which comes from modern relations of slavery and oppression, and the way that has become a feedback loop into the social relations that we have in our current society. So race, in many ways, acts as a structuring myth for our current society, whether we like it or not. You cannot just claim this post-race attitude, like race doesn't matter anymore because there's no biological justification for it anymore. The fact is that it still socially structures oppression and inequity across various different sectors of human societies in which we live in. And in that sense, because the conversations around race structure us, because the conversations around race in the United States Constitution at the outset of the foundation of the nation that I live in, for example, embeds slavery and within its legal institutions. It's persistent throughout. And so it's no simple thing to just claim that we can somehow think beyond or get beyond race. It still acts as a mythologizing structure for us. And is it imaginary? Is it a human creation? Are the gods a human creation? Whether or not one rejects the gods, for example, you can still have the God's wrath. Whether or not you think that you somehow can get beyond or not see race, the colorblind approach, as some people will claim, it doesn't mean that it does not still structure the lives of others, create resentment, and create social problems that will then come back and bite you as well. And so when we think about mythology, we think about concepts of religion or the bindingness, if we're going to take the religare, to bind, etymology or word history of the word religion. That's what we think about in terms of like myth being embedded in our social structures, race being embedded in our social structures. It doesn't mean that we should not attend to it. It doesn't mean that we can ignore it. We should explicitly not ignore it. We should try and deal with it. But when we look at it embedded in this notion of Western civilization, which certain people use as code to uphold their white supremacist notions, then we especially need to unpack the ways that it persists as an organizing force in our contemporary world. So then, just to come back to the text here, Odysseus is here in the underworld, and he is dealing with myth here. I think, like, the way that the Odyssey has been used in our culture, or to back up this idea of Western civilization, it has been mythologized, right? In the sense that it's put into required curriculum for students across the board. Why do they need to read all of this? What is the requirement? What is the need to have a text like this show up? So the texts that structure our lives then become mythologized. But this, as a book of writing being written down, it's a piece of literature, right? So Greek mythology is operating behind the scenes, structures the lives of the characters in Homer's tale here. And there are various different intertexts, like the Oresteia, or the killing of Agamemnon, which shows up over and over again in this particular text, right? So at this moment, when Odysseus is in the underworld, when he's in the kingdom of the dead, this is when we see that fabric of mythology in Greek culture coming into Odysseus's mouth as the storyteller, where he gives awe, to the Phaeacians, as we will see. So he asks about Penelope, and here's about that. So he's talking to his mother. He asks about Telemachus. He asks about Laertes. And then he longs to embrace his mother's spirit, but he can't. He tries. And we see this as a persistent notion in culture of the ghost who we try to grab, but we can't see. They're a shade. 3 times I rushed toward her, desperate to hold her. 3 times she fluttered through my fingers, sifting away like a shadow, dissolving like a dream. And each time the grief cut to the heart, sharper. Yes, and I cried out to her, words winging into the darkness. Mother, why not wait for me? How can I long to hold you? So even here in the house of death, we can fling our loving arms around each other, take some joy in the tears that numb the heart. Or is this just some wraith that great Persephone sends my way to make me ache with sorrow all the more? And his mother tells him what's up. My son, the unluckiest man alive, this is no deception sent by Queen Persephone. This is just the way of mortals when we die. Sinews no longer bind the flesh and bones together. The fire in all its fury burns the body down to ashes. Once life slips from the white bones, and the spirit wrestling flitters away, flown like a dream. But you must long for the daylight. Go quickly. Remember all these things, so one day you can tell them to the wife. And so again, all of this, all of these adventures are so that he can go tell the stories again. Tell the stories of the dead. Tell the stories of the Phaeacians and the travels that you've been on, Odysseus. Then a whole slew of dead women come and hoard around Odysseus. We get Tyro, the lover of Poseidon, who shows up. We get lots of twins showing up, or brothers, Peleus and Neleus. then we get Aesopus' daughter Antiope, who was another lover of Zeus. So these lovers of the gods that have shown up, these women, are a theme in this particular moment of the text. And then the twin founders of Thebes, right? Amphion and Zethus. And then we know that that's another theme that will show up later with Romulus and Remus, for example, for the founding of Rome. The idea that twins found cities. And that will structure itself into notions of sacrifice as well, or it will maybe not structure itself into, but it will reflect the structures of sacrifice, the scapegoats having two goats where one is driven off and the other one is sacrificed to the gods. And so ancient relationships between human and animal sacrifice, I think, are behind the scenes here. And so the founder of Thebes as well, and a theme that has shown up is the earlier rivalries between Thebes and Athens, and overcoming that and unifying Greece. And so there's this early notions of what will become, in later history, a sense of nationality or national identity. He then sees Alcmena, Amphitryon's wife, who slept in the clasp of Zeus and merged in love and brought forth Heracles, rugged will and a lion heart. And I saw Megara too, magnanimous Creon's daughter, wed to the stalwart Heracles, the hero never daunted. And so Heracles will show up later on in the text, but what we see are these references, these allusions, as we say in literary studies, to other mythological stories, the intertext of other stories that aren't the main part, the main plot of this telling, but that show us as hearers, if we're putting ourselves in the place of the Phaeacians who are hearing Odysseus tell these tales of his exploits, then we see all of the things that he knows. We get a different name, Epicaste, also known as Jocasta, here showing up, the wife of Oedipus, but also the mother of Oedipus showing up. And so this reference to that myth. We get Leda, Tyndareus's wife, who'd borne the king two sons, intrepid twins, Castor, the breaker of horses, and the hardy boxer Polydeuces, both buried now in the life-giving earth, though still alive. Even under the earth, Zeus grants them that distinction. One day alive, the next day dead. Each twin by turns, they both hold the honors equal to the gods. And so that, again, that notion of twinship, which is in so many ancient cultures around the world, and it's structured in different ways. So twinship models exist all across the continent that I'm sitting on, the Turtle Island, for example, but the twinship models in Native American structuring stories work very differently than the twinship models in the ancient Greek stories here as well. And so I want to push against that kind of universalizing archetypal type of theory that people associate with Carl Jung. We then get Orion, who's shown up a number of times in the text. We get Ariadne and Theseus, Phaedra and Procris. And then this quick reference, and I'll just read this out just because it was interesting to me. Phaedra and Procris I saw too, and lovely Ariadne, daughter of Minos, that harsh king. The day Theseus tried to spirit her off from Crete to Athens' sacred heights, but he got no joy from her. Artemis killed her first on wave-washed Dia's shores, accused by Dionysus. Dionysus is this later god that comes in. He's a god from the east, associated with India, associated with drunkenness and wine, the bacchanals, to use the Romans' terms, and especially the disordering of kings, like the outside of the city walls. these orgiastic affairs that would tear apart law. And so it's just a brief mention in passing here. I'm not a major figure in this text. And then we get this narrative break that happens, and in the narrative break, the Phaeacians break in, and Arete, whose name means excellence, right? The queen is the first to recognize Odysseus. Phaeacians, how does this man impress you now? His looks, his build, the balanced mind inside him. The stranger is my guest, but each of you princes shares the honor here. So let's not be too hasty to send him away and skimp on his gifts. His need is great. Great as the riches piled up in all your houses, thanks to the gods' will. And then they all agree that they're going to give him these parting gifts. Our guest, much as he longs for passage home, must stay and wait here until tomorrow, till I can collect his whole array of gifts. And Odysseus then agrees to stay another day. So his talking of tales has won him something, right? It's won him not only passage home, but they're going to load that ship down with parting gifts. And Alcinous says, Odysseus, one look at you, and we know that you are no one who would cheat us, no fraud, such as the dark soil breeds and spreads across the face of the earth these days. Crowds of vagabonds frame their lies so tightly none can test them. But you, what grace you give to words, and what good sense within. You have told your story with all a singer's skill. The miseries you endured, your great Achaeans too. But come now, tell me truly, your godlike comrades, did you see any heroes down in the house of death? So he asks about the heroes. And we know, if you're like a critical reader here, we also know that the Phaeacians are going to have Poseidon's wrath wreaked on them once he leaves their island with all of these gifts. So is he being a trickster here? Is he taking all of these gifts, knowing that it's going to cause calamity when he leaves? Odysseus goes into the story of Agamemnon, and so we get the story of his murder of the Oresteia showing up here as well. We get a brief mention that not only is Agamemnon killed, but Cassandra, who was the seeing daughter of Priam, the king of Troy, who dies in the Iliad. Cassandra, who keeps seeing all of these things, is brought home as the concubine of Agamemnon, and she is killed in front of his eyes by Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra before they kill him and all of his men as well. And so this curse, this diatribe, shows up in around the lines 490 in Book 11 that curses womankind. There's nothing more deadly bestial than a woman that set on works like these. What a monstrous thing she plotted, slaughtered her own lawful husband. But she, the queen of hell bent on outrage, bathes in shame not only herself, but the whole breed of womankind, even the honest ones to come, forever down the years. So in, Judeo-Christian influenced society, oftentimes this is like kind of blaming of womankind is put on Eve in the apple or the Garden of Eden or something. But here we see in this, earlier text, at the outset of Western civilization, we see the blaming of womankind as an entire entity, as an entire race, we might think, if we were thinking in terms of critical race theory and the ways that race transforms all the time. How are women as a category racialized as a kind of separate group with their separate lot in life, with their separate characteristics of revenge, and unseemliness? He goes on, how terrible Zeus from the very start, the Thunder King, has hated the race of Atreus with a vengeance, his trustiest weapon, women's twisted wiles. What armies of us died for the sake of Helen? Clytemnestra schemed your death while you were worlds away. True, true, Agamemnon's ghost kept pressing on. So even your own wife, never indulge her too far. Never reveal the whole truth, whatever you may know. Just tell her part of it, but be sure to hide the rest. Not that you, Odysseus, will be murdered by your wife because Penelope is too good. But my wife, she never ever let me see eyes on my own son. She killed me first, his father. And so then there's an asking. Agamemnon asks after his son Orestes, but Odysseus, of course, doesn't know enough about it yet. And then Odysseus comes across all of these famous soldiers from Achaean soldiers from the Iliad: Achilles, Patroclus, Antilochus, Ajax. He talks to Achilles, who asks after his own son. And Achilles makes this interesting mention about death. He says, no winning words about death to me. And he says, Odysseus says, I see you in this glory and death. And Achilles says, I'd rather slave on earth for another man, some dirt poor tenant farmer who scrapes to keep alive, than rule down here over all the breathless dead. But come, tell me the news about my gallant son. Did he make his way to the wars? Did the boy become a champion? Yes or no? So here again, embedded in the fabric of society, not only is slavery, these tenant farmers, but also the idea that one's own lineage with their sons, this patriarchal lineage, which has a disdain for women, wants to see the son distinguish themselves as a kind of champion in war, especially. And we get some information about Achilles' son, Neoptolemus. Odysseus says, I can report the whole story as you wish. He always charged ahead in battle. He was, urging to get out of the horse. He wasn't afraid when he was in the Trojan horse. He just wanted to get out and fight the Trojans. And he comes away from Troy unscathed. And Odysseus is quick to say that random raging Ares, the god of war, of course, plays no favorites. So the fact that there's no favorites in war only intensifies the glory of Achilles' son, because he comes away from the Trojan Wars unscathed, which shows how great he is. Odysseus then tries to make amends with Ajax, with whom he has had arguments in life, and of course that shows up in the Iliad as well. But Ajax continues to reject him in death. He sees Minos again. He sees Orion. He sees Tydeus. These images from Greek mythology, right? Two vultures hunched on either side of him, digging into his liver, beaking deep in the blood sac, and he with his frantic hands could never beat them off, for he had once dragged off the famous consort of Zeus in all her glory, Leto, threading her way toward Pythos ridge over the lovely dancing rings of Panopeus. And then he sees Tantalus, who can't drink water. When he bends down, it goes down, and then the fruit comes down and he can't reach up. And then he sees Sisyphus, the image of the man rolling up the boulder that falls down on him just as he reaches the peak, over and over again. And then he talks, finally, last but not least, to Heracles. And Heracles particularly recognizes Odysseus as someone who is like himself. So again, when I say, is Odysseus a reliable narrator? He's taking the greatest of Greek heroes, and he has him say, royal son of Laertes, Odysseus, famed for exploits, luckless man, you too, braving out a fate as harsh as the fate I bore. alive in the light of day. Son of Zeus that I was, my torments never ended. Forced to slave for a man, not half the man I was. He saddled me with the worst heartbreaking labors. Why, he sent me down here once to retrieve the hound that guards the dead. No harder task for me, he thought, but I dragged the great beast up from the underworld to the earth, and Hermes and gleaming-eyed Athena blazed the way. With that he turned, and back he went to the house of death, but I held fast in place, hoping that others might still come. Shades of famous heroes, men who died in the old days, and ghosts of an even older age I longed to see. Theseus and Pirithous, the gods' own radiant sons, but before I could, the dead came surging around me, hordes of them, thousands, raising up unearthly cries, and blanching terror gripped me. Panicked now that Queen Persephone might send up from death some monstrous head, some Gorgon's searing face that would turn him to stone. Right? I rushed back to my ship, commanded all hands to take to the decks, cast the cables quickly. They swung aboard at once. They sat to their oars, to the oars and ranks, and strode, and a strong tide of the ocean swept her on downstream, sped by our rowing first, then by a fresh fair wind. And so this ends being the escape from the leaving of the underworld. And the underworld, of course, is where Odysseus is not just merged with the dead, but merged with mythology itself, merged with the intertextual stories that make up and shape his culture, even if we only got little glimpses of each of them. We'll carry on in the next contextualized reading. Thank you for your attention. If you can support us on Patreon, please do so. It's not required, but this is very much a labor of love for me. Have a great afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever and whenever you are.